Good morning. It's Monday morning. So we're going to spend this week's lessons kind of focusing on the whole year, getting it all down. Because normally at this point we'd be kind of thinking about mock exams. God knows what's going to happen with those. But we do need to make sure we've got, good revision material in your folders for next year. Okay. So a little reminder, I've shown you this many times before, that you have to do that compulsory question on slavery. Still waiting for a few people to give me your essays, and then you choose between, you have to do 2 more questions from the 4 options there. So what we're going to do today is try and summarise everything we've learnt down into something that's sustainable and we can try and remember. So in the book, page 8 and 9, there's a huge, long timeline of the key events over the whole period that we've looked at. So what I want you to do over the next 2 lessons is create like a huge revision timeline to try and bring it all together, get it in perspective. And I think this is quite difficult, really. So the first event on the top of our timeline was in 1789, was the French Revolution. And what I want you to do is think about that event and think about how did it impact on our 5 units, our politics unit or our slavery unit or our industrialisation unit, whatever. So I've selected on the French Revolution, the 2 biggest impacts of that was it clearly, because of its ideas of liberty, equality and fraternity, encouraged people like Thomas Paine to begin to push for reform in our political system in Britain, etc. And also probably the second biggest impact was the impacts on the abolitionist movement. So because when the French revolutionaries took power in Paris, they abolished slavery as we looked at, and this led to decreased support and actually outright anger towards people like Wilberforce and Clarkson, because how could you possibly support the ideas that the French were doing? So what I want you to do on each event is really look at the 5 topics we've looked at and think about how did it impact on one of those 5. So again, I've done it when the second one on the list on the right hand side, 1793, the war with France began. What was the impact of that? Well, politically, Britain obviously was fearful of, they saw the aristocracy being guillotined in Paris. They were fearful of their own lives. So fearful of a revolution in Britain, they passed lots of repressive acts, such as the 6 Acts, as we know. And it really led to a clampdown for protest movements, Peterloo and all that kind of stuff. The other impact it had was on the poverty unit. So as soon as that war began, the Napoleon's navy blockaded the UK and stopped imports of food, which led to an increasing price of food, which people began to question about how can we possibly afford to provide all this poor relief. It obviously led to an increase in poverty, etc. So that was the main 2 impacts of that. And then the next event is Spina and Lerm in 1795, and there's only really one unit that's affected, is obviously poverty, and that gave a more uniform distribution of this kind of 3 loaves of bread in each family. So rather than this kind of patchwork of, very localised poverty that had kind of grown out of Elizabethan poor laws, it gave a slightly more uniform approach. So there's loads and loads. It's going to take you quite a long time, and it's actually quite a useful exercise in terms of you've got to think about the event. So, for example, 1799, Robert Owen, which is the 4th event on the list, takes over New Lanarkshire. So it's clear to me the 2 main areas you need to focus on is obviously the Unions unit. What was the impact of that on the cooperation, and also his ideas. When they were discussing poverty, thinking about poverty and those ideas of Benthamism, he was obviously against those with Thomas Paine, etc. So you need to look at that. Combination Acts, for example, when Napoleon proclaimed Emperor of France, the impact of that was one of the first things he did, because he needed money to fight wars, because obviously I don't want to get into this too much, all the countries in Europe declared war against Napoleon. Napoleon needed the money, so he needed money from the slave plantations. So as soon as he introduced slavery, it led to increased support for Wilberforce and Clarkson, the abolitionist movement. So that actually helped that particular area. So that's really what I want you to do. There's quite a lot of things you might be looking at something and thinking, what was that? You need to go back in the index. You need to look at what the impact was. Which of the 5 areas did it impact on? And just do 2 maximum. Sometimes you'll just it'll just be on one thing. So, for example, 1859, Samuel Smiles published Self-Help. That's really got to do with poverty. That's the poverty unit there. You need to explain what that was and all those types of things. So it's a lot to go back. It's kind of like a big summer exercise here. I've also put all the clocks and all the whatever they're called, the trees, just to kind of summarise each unit for you. So that's a big task. A lot of reading, flicking back, reminding yourself about how each event impacted on them. Okay, thanks.